Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The U.S.-led bombing campaign in Iraq and Syria has seen its biggest days so far, with British warplanes joining the attack. At least 24 strikes were launched between the two countries, where the Islamic State controls a vast stretch of territory. Britain took part in the strikes for the first time since its parliament voted to authorize the campaign Friday. The strikes today have hit towns including Syria's Kobani, which has come under a sustained Islamic State assault that's forced tens of thousands of Syrian Kurds to flee. The White House has confirmed its relaxed standards aimed at preventing civilian deaths for the U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. According to Yahoo News, the Obama administration's acknowledged that a policy announced last year calling for near certainty of no civilian casualties will not apply to the current bombing. The admission came in response to queries about a strike that killed up to a dozen civilians in the Syrian village of Kafr Daryan last week. The bodies of women and children were reportedly pulled from the rubble after a missile hit a home for displaced residents. The United Nations, meanwhile, has issued a new warning over the dire humanitarian conditions in Syria. Briefing the Security Council, Emergency Relief Coordinator Valerie Amos said the World Food Program will be forced to end operations unless it can obtain additional funding.
Millions are short of food, of medicines, and almost 3 million children are not in school. 11 million vulnerable people inside Syria require urgent humanitarian assistance, and of those, 6.4 million people are internally displaced. Without additional funds, the World Food Programme will be forced to end its operations completely within 2 months. Rations have already been cut in order to continue to reach as many people as possible. Winter is fast approaching, and vital supplies are needed to protect people from the cold.
The Taliban has carried out a suicide bombing on 2 buses carrying soldiers in the Afghan capital of Kabul, killing 7 people and wounding 21. The attack comes one day after the signing of a U.S.-Afghan security pact that'll keep 10,000 U.S. troops in the country after this year's formal end to combat operations. U.S. Ambassador James Cunningham signed the agreement at a ceremony on Tuesday.
This agreement will enable the United States to help the security forces to build on this progress after the ISAF mission comes to a close and as a new NATO mission begins. Our close defense and security cooperation will provide the foundation for Afghanistan to continue its impressive development and to build on the achievements of the past. Our agreement will also contribute to stability not only in Afghanistan, but throughout the region.
The new Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, signed the accord after his predecessor, Hamid Karzai, refused to ratify it. Tens of thousands remain in the streets of Hong Kong in the 4th day of mass protests calling for greater political freedom. The demonstrations swelled over the weekend after a crackdown on students opposing China's plan to select candidates in Hong Kong's 2017 elections. Protest leaders have vowed to remain and take over government buildings until the resignation of Hong Kong city leader Leung Chun-ying and a free vote for his successor. Today's protests come as China and Hong Kong observe National Day, which marks the anniversary of China's founding, Communist China's founding. A patient who recently returned from Liberia has been diagnosed with the first case of Ebola in the United States. The head of the Centers for Disease Control, Thomas Frieden, announced the news on Monday, one day after the patient's admission to a Dallas hospital.
This individual left Liberia on the 19th of September, arrived in the U.S. on the 20th of September, had no symptoms when departing Liberia or entering this country, but 4 or 5 days later, around the 24th of September, began to develop symptoms. On the 26th of September, initially sought care, and Sunday, the 28th of September, was admitted to a hospital in Texas and placed on isolation. We received in our laboratory today specimens from the individual, tested them, and they tested positive for Ebola.
The CDC says family members and others who made contact with the patient after he fell ill could be placed in isolation to prevent wider infection. Passengers who traveled on the same U.S.-bound plane wouldn't be at risk because the virus is only spread through direct contact with bodily fluids of a patient showing symptoms. At his news conference, Thomas Frieden said he believes this case will be contained.
The bottom line here is that I have no doubt that we will control this importation or this case of Ebola so that it does not spread widely in this country. It is certainly possible that someone who had contact with this individual, a family member or other individual, could develop Ebola in the coming weeks. But there is no doubt in my mind that we will stop it here.
President Obama has reportedly approved a plan that would let several thousand child refugees from Central America apply for asylum in the United States. The approach focuses on having the children apply from their home countries instead of making the dangerous trek to cross the U.S. border. The plan does not increase the number of refugees allowed in, capping visas for Latin America and Caribbean at 4,000. Oklahoma prison officials have released a new protocol for executions following April's botched lethal injection of Clayton Lockett, which lasted 43 minutes. Media witnesses described Lockett writhing and moaning in apparent agony. Lockett was injected with an untested cocktail of drugs, which included midazolam, a sedative also used in other prolonged executions, including one that lasted 2 hours in Arizona. The new protocol in Oklahoma allows the continued use of midazolam, but calls for a dose 5 times what Lockett received. Changes also include more staff training, contingency plans for when problems arise, and a reduction of the number of media witnesses at executions by more than half, from 12 to 5.